Do a oh, and we're recording now. Hello, future people. I hope the world is it looks brighter from there. Anyway, so about Outhouse LGBTQ plus Centre. So we'll talk about Outhouse just very, very quickly. So Outhouse is Dublin's LGBTQ plus centre. We're at 105 Capel Street, so right at the top of Capel Street, opposite the Black Sheep. And we've had our doors open since 1997, though we've actually been an organization since 1996. So our 30-year anniversary is next year. And what we do essentially is we are Dublin's LGBTQ plus centre. So our aim is to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus people in Dublin, to provide a safe space to make them feel seen and to celebrate the community as well. And we do that through, I suppose, four main methods. Or I suppose the four pillars of what we do is first is connection, a place for people to discover themselves, to discover their passions, and discover other people like them. Um, Community support, so that's basic accessing of information, providing of programs, peer support groups, the likes of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Narcotics Anonymous, peer support groups for intersex people or asylum seekers, um, and then a one-to-one casework service also. Culture, expressing creativity, heritage, and fun. So we have a theatre in our basement. We have Dublin's biggest LGBT library on our first floor, which is open to everyone to come see. So I'd recommend dropping in at some point. So we're big on culture, and then campaigning, being like a strong and credible voice for the LGBTQ plus community, particularly in terms of representing the community to the government and to other state bodies, who don't always listen to us. But I always say at this point that there are a lot of, even though sometimes the it can be quite big and scary. There are a lot of really brilliant people working within the government and working within the civil service who are doing their best to do amazing work. So yeah, we have the building, and I suppose it's not on this, but one of the main things you'll know about Outhouse as well is that we have a community cafe. So when you walk in the door, there's a cafe there. It's welcome to everyone. We don't check cards at the door. So if you're ever looking for some information, if you ever want to come in and have a chat, have a cup of tea, Outhouse is the place to be. So that's the quick promotional advertisement bit and some context as to what we do. So we're going to talk about, I suppose, the LGBTQ plus community in context, and there's a lot to get through, so I'm kind of running through it very quickly, but there'll be time for questions towards the end. So, what does LGBTQ plus stand for? So, LGBTQ plus is an acronym which encompasses a very broad community of different gender and sexuality based identities. So, we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and the Q is queer or questioning. And then you'll often see a plus thrown in at the end to, I suppose, encompass further the the more identities that exist within the community that aren't necessarily represented in the initial acronym. So it's a very, very broad based community. You'll also often see the LGBT community referred to as the queer community. And if you're, I suppose, reading or watching older slightly older material, you might see it as the gay community or the gay and lesbian community. I suppose over time, the term has expanded and expanded to be a more umbrella term to cover more and more people of, I suppose, while very different and diverse, kind of similar experiences in a lot of ways. But you'll often hear me, and I know particularly in an academic context, actually, queer or queer theory or queer community is often used. So I'll often switch between the two, LGBTQ plus and queer, because LGBTQ plus is a mouthful to say a billion times on a 50-minute Zoom call. So if that's what I say, that's you'll understand what it is. Um, so I suppose very quickly to go through the LGBTQ plus one and one 101. So there's a really great resource, and you'll find it. freely online called The Gingerbread Man, or The Gingerbread Person, I suppose. And it kind of, in a very quick and very understandable graphic, explains the difference between what we're talking about here. So particularly when we're talking about gender and trans identities, there are kind of three main things to think about. So gender identity is your psychological sense of self. So on in the inside, in your heart and in your heart and in your brain, I suppose, who you are and who you align with. And that may be the gender that you were assigned at birth. It may not be. It may not be any gender at all. It may be all of the genders. But gender identity is, I suppose, on the inside who you feel like. Gender expression is how you express yourself to the world. So we all have some form of gender, just to be clear, we all have some form of gender identity and gender expression, um, even if we're not trans necessarily. So gender expression is how you present yourself to the world. So for example, I today am presenting myself very masculine and manly to the world. I have a mustache, which is often attributed to mask or masculine identities. I'm wearing a jumper. Well, I guess a jumper can be quite unisex. Depends on, and it's actually, I'm actually very unisex today with a brown jumper. But say if you were to wear a handbag, it's often ascribed to women. So this is your gender expression, what you present into the world. And again, it can be quite normative. It can be quite it can feel quite natural and not really, I suppose, and not really stand out unless you're looking for it. Or it can be a mix of fun and lots of people kind of live within those borders, or day to day will change their expression. A dress on Tuesday and a tank top on Wednesday. And then your sex assigned at birth refers to the sex that was recorded on your birth certificate, which is typically determined by things like your genitals, chromosomes, hormones, and more. But just to be clear, sex assigned at birth is physiological, it's body, but it's not gender, which is gender is more in the heart and in the head. Um, Again, these things can feel very overwhelming and maybe a little bit charged, especially in the world that we live in at the moment. But these are concepts, even if you don't know, these are concepts that you embody and engage with every single day. But if you need to think about it, gender identity is your heart and your head. Gender expression is your clothes and what you put into the world, and then your sex assigned at birth is physiology and often what a doctor decided to put on your birth certificate at some point in your very, very early life. And then attraction or orientation. And this actually is kind of what many people think of when they think of the queer community, which refers to how this is who you're physically, spiritually, or emotionally attracted to, which isn't necessarily a component of gender, but are often quite closely related to each other. So, for example, if you're a woman who is attracted to men, you'd be a heterosexual person. That is your orientation or your attraction. If you're a woman attracted to other women, you're probably a lesbian, but not necessarily. So yeah, so that's kind of the 101s, which I could talk about all day and we could get deeper into. But if you have any questions, you can hold them out, hold for them at the end. Pronouns. So this again is a very, it's kind of fun, like hilariously politically charged conversation at the moment. But pronouns are again, like everything I've just talked about, pronouns are an important aspect of one's gender expression and can be used to validate a person's gender identity. Everyone uses pronouns, everyone uses some form of pronouns. It's actually, in the English language, pretty much impossible to refer to things without use of pronouns. It's just a grammatical structure. But why I suppose it's controversial in the mainstream media is people who maybe transition from one gender to another will ask people to use a different set of pronouns. So someone who maybe was assigned male at birth and is now a trans woman might ask people to use she, her pronouns instead of he, him pronouns. In a lot of ways, that's all that it is. But it's a very quick and very easy way, and I think particularly in settings where you don't really know people, or you're trying to build a bit of psychological safety, or build in a bit of safety for LGBT people in the room. Just asking pronouns and validating pronouns is a very quick and very easy way to do that. Um, but yeah, those are pronouns. We can come back to pronouns if we want to. But moving on to, I suppose, the key issues impacting the LGBTQ plus community at the moment. And I suppose we do a talk on the history of LGBTQ plus people in Ireland, which is its own 50-minute conversation. But in the last, I suppose, 30 years, we've seen quite an improvement um, in the standing, and I suppose and the lives of a lot of LGBTQ plus people in Ireland. And you can see this through, I suppose, the more governmental and law-based changes, such as decriminalization and marriage equality, but also I think um, generally in the social and cultural representation of LGBTQ plus people in Ireland has improved over time, slowly but surely. Like the fact that I'm even speaking to you today is a mark of that improvement. That would not have happened. Um, wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, and definitely wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. So quite an improvement, but also I suppose it's worth mentioning that this improvement is also particularly focused on, I suppose, more well-off um, white Irish gay people, gay and lesbian people, I think more broadly. I suppose we can talk a little bit more about some of the barriers and some of the issues that come when people have more intersecting identities. So, for example, trans people and access to healthcare is a very, very massive issue at the moment. Um, Refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in Ireland, again, already having a tough time. But if you add on to that, if the say you're an asylum seeker or a refugee who's also a queer person, you're kind of compounding some of the issues that arise in both communities in one individual. So I suppose move on. Barriers in access and healthcare is still a very, very big issue in the LGBTQ plus community. And like I said, particularly for the trans community, access in healthcare in Ireland has become pretty much impossible in a lot of ways, and is the measurably the worst in the EU as we're going. So we're bottom of the table on that, which is something very much not to be proud of. Shame and stigma still very, very big, particularly for young people in Ireland, belong to who's just down the road from us, who work directly with LGBTQ plus young people. Um, they do extensive research, and particularly in schools with LGBTQ plus young people. And unfortunately, the shame and the stigma and the bullying hasn't subsided in a measurable way over the past couple of years, and in fact has gotten a bit worse with the turn that that we see in mainstream politics across Europe and in America. So the shame and stigma is very much still there. And then also worth mentioning that that this is maybe something that is more prevalent also in rural settings than it is in urban settings, but not necessarily. As a proud culture myself, I'm not going to throw us under the bus necessarily, but it's still very much there. Poor mental health and well-being, again, LGBTQ plus people um, statistically have quite bad mental health, unfortunately, and substance abuse issues. This arising from trauma, often in youth. So poor mental health and well-being is a big issue within the community, and something that we, I suppose, deal with every day. Legal inequalities for LGBTQ plus families. You might have seen this more recently in the news in Ireland. LGBT Ireland, another organisation, is pushing quite hard to um, I suppose, equalize the situation for LGBTQ plus parents and families. Poverty and homelessness, a big issue for the LGBTQ plus community. Again, especially when you have intersecting identities, trans people in particular find it very, very difficult to hold on to housing. And this is amidst a rising housing crisis. Not a rising, a housing crisis that's been here for decades now and only gets worse. Um, Obviously, that impacts on the more marginalized members of society more than anyone else, and it's only getting worse, which is brilliant. We love that. Uh, Rise in extremism then and hate speech. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, we see this across the Western world, in particular, and in America, kind of like at an amazingly fast pace over the past couple of months. The rise of extremism and hate speech has um, obviously had a knock-on impact on Irish people and Irish society, and on the LGBTQ plus community in Ireland. And like, to be quite frank, being on the ground with the community every day, there's an awful lot of fear, and an awful lot of instances of hate crimes and hate speech coming in our door. And now, listen, it's always been there to some extent or another, but there is a noticeable uptick, as I suppose the Western world slides to the right. So yeah, that's a brilliant slide where it's all good news and really positive. It's very, very heavy, so I apologize for that. But I suppose this is the reality of the situation. It's not all bad. And particularly first, there are instances of really great joy and celebration. And I think I suppose if you really feel affected by that, it's worth kind of remembering in those moments. And that's what we do, because again, we kind of are at the bulwark of it and deal with a lot of very heavy things day to day. But there are also really, really brilliant stories of triumph and love, and community, which you can see as well. So yeah, just to take the sharpness off that slide a little bit. But yeah. So trans awareness. Unfortunately, the trans community have become the focal point of the current culture war. Um, Again, particularly in the UK and the United States, but we see it spilling over here, and into Europe and the Western world in general. Um, I think it's worth, I suppose, mentioning like right up top that trans people are not new, and not particularly special. Like in a lot of ways, trans people have existed across the world and across societies, since people have existed, and you can find examples of gender variance and gender deviance across the world. Again, across history and different societies. It's this idea that, I suppose, that in quotation trans ideology is a new thing is very like provably untrue, and just a way to try scare people about a group of people who genuinely, I don't know if you've met trans people, genuinely not very scary. They're just like everyone. So I suppose in terms of key terminology when you're talking about or thinking about, or talking to trans people. So transgender or trans is, I suppose, a transgender person is someone whose gender identity or gender expression does not correspond to the sex that they were assigned at birth. So, and many experience gender dysphoria, which they may seek to alleviate through transitioning, often adopting a different name or a different set of pronouns. So, for a very basic example, someone who maybe was assigned male at birth, grows up and in their gender identity, in their heart and in their head, feel like a woman. So they transition, and their gender expression then becomes that of a woman, and that essentially is what a trans woman is. But in a lot of ways, trans people and transgender identities again encompass a whole range of different identities, and different ways of people expressing themselves and expressing gender. Uh, but yeah, so transitioning, what I mentioned earlier, transitioning is a term that refers to the process through which trans people achieve the appearance, gender expression, and self-image that feels right to them. Um, it may include social, legal, or medical transitioning. So Someone might change their name on legal documents. They may get surgery to more adequately match their own gender expression. They may socially transition, which is to say, ask the people around them to refer to them with their preferred pronouns and their preferred names, but not necessarily do any surgeries or change any legal documents. And some often as well, this is a process that may include each different element at different times. So it's I suppose unique to each individual person, and the journey and the destination is often individual to each person. Um, and I'll always say at this point, if you're curious about that or you don't really know where someone's going, it's always just worth having a conversation and asking. Um, I always say during these things that I don't know any queer or LGBT person who gets really, really upset at someone asking a genuine question from the goodness of their heart, you know? Um, yeah, generally people are quite happy to chat, especially again, if you're coming from quite an open and honest place. Which to be fair, LGBTQ plus people are also used to those questions not coming from a open and honest place, so it might be worth expressing that in the moment. Um, yeah. Then we're moving on to, I suppose, non-binary people, people whose gender identity is neither exclusively man or woman. It can, non-binary people live kind of fluidly within the margins of that. And non-binary kind of encompasses a whole bunch of different um, identities and forms of gender expression. And then finally, cisgender is someone who is not transgender or non-binary. Um, yeah, so it just describes someone whose gender expression, gender identity, and sex assigned at birth all align. The vast majority of people in the world are cisgender. Yeah, I think it's like 90% of people, or maybe 95% of people are cisgender. So again, it's sometimes kind of have to laugh when we talk about the culture war against trans people because they're quite a small community, all said. Um, but yeah, so the main challenges with the trans community or facing the trans community, sorry, I'm going to take a sip. So I suppose in a lot of ways, again, what we're talking about is in terms of intersecting identities. Um, Trans people face a lot of the same issues as other members of the LGBTQ plus community, but often I suppose the trans community in particular is being uh, particularly having a hard time at the moment. So I suppose in terms of main challenges, coming out and being their full self is a very big one. Many trans people take quite a long time to get to where they want to be or to get to a place where they feel happy in themselves. Like I know we work with trans people who are transitioning in their 20s, and we work with trans people who are only now transitioning in their 60s. Um, and that, I suppose, is a result in a lot of ways of internalized homophobia and transphobia, but also external transphobia and being in positions where they don't feel safe to become their full self. Lack of legal protection for the trans community is quite a big issue at the moment, though we are now coming up on 10 years since the Gender Recognition Act, which was a very positive step forward, I suppose, legislatively for the trans community. Challenges with identity documents, uh, quite difficult to legally transition and change your name uh, and gender marker on things like passports or even on the likes of bills and the likes can very, very quickly and very easily become quite a barrier for trans people, especially um, when we think of accessing healthcare, employment, and housing. So, for example, someone maybe has transitioned and is socially living as a woman, but doesn't have the money, say, to go through the process of changing identity markers on their legal documents. So when they then go in for an interview or apply for housing or yeah, even onboarding onto a job, the names that are on their documents, their official documents, are not the names that they use. And then even that means that you have to out yourself and, you know, have that conversation with your employer and maybe with, the other employees as well and HR departments and the like. So it can be quite a small thing that becomes a massive barrier to life. Um, Most affected by poor healthcare. Like I said before, trans people are having a very, very difficult time accessing healthcare and gender affirming care, but also generally in the healthcare system. Trans people, for the reasons that I talked about before, have quite a lot of difficulty accessing healthcare and experience quite a lot of transphobia. Whether the healthcare providers mean to or not. So often it's coming from a place of just of not knowing and of ignorance. High risk of poverty and high risk of violence, harassment, and discrimination. Again, we're seeing more and more of this. Underrepresentation, and then barriers to further advancement and career progression. So, like I said before, trans people find it very difficult to find housing, are underemployed, or unemployed, have high rates of unemployment. So, all of these kind of, I suppose, in terms of legal protections, documents, housing, healthcare, they kind of all come together. For a lot of trans people, and a lot of trans people find themselves in very, very difficult situations. And then into also, I suppose, not only is it difficult practically, but then also in a world where trans people are not widely accepted socially and can um, often experience quite a lot of discrimination and violence, can lead to some very, very difficult situations for trans people. Um, but yeah, so the numbers don't lie. So in Ireland, Tenny, who actually work out of our building if you're ever looking for them, Tenny, the Trans Equality Network Ireland, did a report that found that 55% of trans workers experience or witness transphobic bullying, and 45 are concealing their identity to avoid discrimination. Um, and like on a personal note, I have a good close friend who's a trans person, and is actively not transitioning at the moment because they're in a very precarious position with their job, and with their housing situation. So, and that's causing her an awful lot of stress and anxiety. Um, in the School Climate Survey report in 2019, published by Belong To, who I spoke about earlier, the key findings is that 73% of LGBTQ plus students feel unsafe at school, and 77 have experienced harassment based on their or their sexual orientation, gender expression, or ethnic origin. And actually, that report has been updated for 2024. If you ever want to read something extremely sad and depressing, you can find that on Belong To's website, but it's also very illuminating. But those numbers have actually risen since 2019. I believe now it's at 78% of students feel unsafe in school, and it's 85% have been verbally harassed. And I think it's close to 30% have been physically assaulted in school, LGBTQ plus people. But anyway, it's a resource worth reading. Um, Again, if you maybe make yourself a cup of tea and have a nice lie in the next day after it. But according to a survey by Transgender Europe, about 39% of transgender individuals in the EU reported uh, experience discrimination with healthcare providers. And I suppose for the context in Ireland, the waitlist for gender affirming healthcare is now at 7 years officially. Um, However, we know anecdotally from working with trans people, it's closer to 9 or 10 years now. So from the moment a trans person engages with their GP, for example, and talks about wanting to transition, it'll take close to a decade before they're actually seen in the gender clinic in Ireland, um, which is which is not a good situation considering that gender affirming care is in many ways life-saving, and not getting that care um, heavily impacts on an individual's mental health. But not only mental health, but also for individual trans people kind of having to put their life on hold, um, like I was talking about, until you're fully transitioned and comfortable and able to get full work and get housing, you're kind of in this limbo state, which causes quite a lot of issues and mental strain on trans people. So not great. But we'll move on to something a little bit more positive in terms of creating safe spaces. So I suppose when we're talking about looking to create a safe space for individuals who are part of the queer community, I suppose I'm normally talking to people in HR departments and in their workplaces, but you can bring this really into any kind of situation, any social situations, any clubs or societies you're part of, any classrooms you're working in, any work that you're in. You can always kind of bring bring some of these kind of little tips into the space. But we think of it as a kind of a triangle of individual support, structural support, and cultural support. So individual support kind of refers to the things that you as an individual person can do one to one or in a group to kind of help to foster a feeling of safety and a feeling of more acceptance. Um, Cultural support kind of refers to the wider culture of an organization or a company. And in a lot of ways, like the cultural support can be hard to tangibly nail down. It's more of a feeling. But the cultural support piece is helped by the individual, or created, I guess, by the individual and the structural support. And the structural support is, I suppose, the kind of nuts and bolts legislative policy and process um, parts of an organization or of a company that you can change. So, the likes, well, I'll get to the examples, but policy changes and structural changes. So, I suppose in terms of individual ally and support, listening and staying informed is kind of one of the main things that you can do for LGBTQ plus people. Uh, I know particularly LGBTQ plus young people will often feel uh, quite alone and quite excluded, and maybe a little bit misunderstood, or so I suppose being able to listen to individuals and listen to individuals and staying informed as to the issues that are facing LGBTQ plus people and kind of what's coming up can be very, very important. Um, for example, like I have a friend who found found it very, very meaningful in their workplace, which was, it's they work in a corporate, which I won't name, but found it very meaningful back in, oh goodness, when was that? It was around 2017, 2018, when there was a number of homophobic attacks over the summer, and there was two individuals murdered in Sligo, and found it very, very meaningful when their manager asked them about it, and asked how they were feeling, kind of in that context, even just being aware of those kind of broader trends, because of course it's going to affect an individual, but might not be necessarily noticed by the people around them. Acknowledging privilege is also quite a big part of this. Um, when you're not actively discriminated against, it can be very difficult to kind of see the discrimination when it's happening. Um, and ignoring that can perpetuate it. And I think that this is very good advice for all people, just and all different communities, to kind of look around and be kind of try to think that, like, oh, am I gaining something, or am I not seeing something that's holding this person back based on their identity as a queer person, or as, a person of color. Um, be kind, like I said before, approach everything with positive intent, and treat others how you'd like to be treated. It's very basic, but you know, and part of this is also not asking overly intrusive questions, particularly, I suppose, with trans people, and about their bodies. Maybe not being overly intrusive until you know someone a little bit better, and then avoiding assumptions. can also help. But again, part of this is if you're coming in with a good heart and you're just trying to help, it's hard. It's most queer people are more than happy to chat and ask or answer questions, and be a supportive voice. So speaking up for LGBTQ plus people in the workplace or in your life again can mean an awful lot, especially given that so many LGBTQ plus people are not necessarily out of the closet or may not necessarily choose to identify themselves as part of the community in certain situations. So yeah, quite honestly, you never know um who's around and who can be really hurt by not speaking up for the queer community in those kind of moments. But yeah, building an inclusive culture in the classroom in particular, but in work in general. Using inclusive language and pronouns. Again, very basic stuff. We do it all the time here. Normalize asking people's pronouns when you're referring to them, or sharing your own pronouns can often, even if you don't want to ask someone straight out, it can be useful to, even if you're not trans or you're not queer, I share your own pronouns and kind of like quite honestly, it kind of gives a signal that like, oh, I'm open to respecting your pronouns. You don't need to feel unsafe around me. So sharing pronouns and integrating LGBTQ plus representation and materials into the classroom. Foster respect and safety. Do you know, again, this is all relatively basic stuff, but can be worth reiterating. Setting clear expectations of what kind of language and how we should be expected to be treated or treat others in the classroom or in work, and intervening and speaking up against discrimination when it does happen, and it will happen. It always like it pops up all the time, in one way, shape, or form. But it's very important not to let that go unchecked, because it's kind of sending a signal that that's an okay behavior and that's an okay way to treat people, which it's not. Oh. Integrating LGBTQ plus representation into your coursework and into your work in general. It doesn't have to be super duper obvious. You don't have to have like an LGBT week or anything like that, but just, I suppose, being mindful when you're picking out the historical figures or when you're talking about it. Is there someone that you can include to make it a bit more diverse? And often those are really interesting stories as well. So if you're willing to do a bit of digging, there's often some really great and interesting particularly figures from history, that are worth bringing into those kind of situations. Supporting students' voices and initiatives, encouraging LGBT student clubs, um, advocating for more inclusive policies, and respecting privacy is also quite a big part of this. I think particularly with students, with younger, um, I guess under 18s, but not necessarily, I suppose all people really, is not presuming that the individual is, for example, out with all of their family, come out as a queer person to their family, or even to, more than just their friends or just to you, if you happen to be the person that they come out to. It's just worth being thoughtful in those situations, not to spread the information too easily, because there are some horror stories from that, getting out, and maybe the student doesn't have a safe home life and it gets back to them. It can be a whole issue. And then, yeah, commitment to continuous learning, educating yourself about LGBTQ plus issues, and honestly, even being a part of this chat today. Oh, I know we're running slow, or running out on time, but even being part of this chat today, is a massive part of that learning, and being informed. But very quickly, then structural inequality. So we're looking, I suppose the main thing to get from this is co-designing solutions. And that's a lot of actually the work that we do, particularly within the government, is just being the voice to to represent the community, because obviously even with the purest of hearts, if you're designing a solution, you might necessarily think that this is going to negatively affect the LGBTQ plus community or LGBTQ plus individuals, and it might not, but it also can heavily affect them without you even knowing it. So being part of that co-design and involving LGBTQ plus people in policies and in initiatives, even just having that person in the room does an awful lot to be like, oh wait, actually that's not cool. That's not, that will be that'll have an unintended negative consequence. And yeah, just very quickly moving through the rest, assessing policies and practices, making sure that you have a very inclusive hiring policy, looking at the policies in place, making sure that it's not overly restrictive, uh, communi communicate support resources, um, even being aware of the likes of Outhouse or belong to, so that if you do end up in a situation where you're supporting an LGBTQ plus person, you can point them to the experts and point them to external supports and resources if needs be. Um, yeah, and building community partnerships like we're doing today. But I will always say, like, if you only remember one name, remember Outhouse, because we know everyone else. So if you ever come into any sort of issue or you don't know what to do or you need a bit of guidance on that, literally just pick up the phone and ring or send an email to Outhouse. We're always happy to help. And if we can't help directly, we know someone who can. We know everyone in the city. Um, but kind of on that tangent, we have the Employment Equality Acts, the Equal Status Acts, and the Criminal Justice Acts. All will run through the WRC, and these are all acts that protect marginalized individuals. But we'll be sending on all of these resources after the fact. And like I said, if you need any more information or have any questions, please reach out to Outhouse. But I think yeah, thank you for supporting. But yeah, so I wanted to make sure that we had a bit of time for Q&A. And I'll just say before anyone has any questions, it's literally impossible to offend me. I have heard everything under the sun. So please don't be afraid. There's no question that is too that you feel is too silly or obvious or maybe potentially offensive. I'm not going to take offense. It's all G. So I suppose, do we have any questions? Sinead, you might help me by repeating the question.
Well, there was a lot of worried looks there, Sean, at me when you said that no questions would offend you. I have a question. Yes. Do you want to come up here or do you want me to repeat it? Okay, go ahead. Or in the gender. Oh yes, I remember. So, Sean, you know that we have a lot of single-sex schools in Ireland.
Yeah.
How does it work if, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, how does it work if a student is transgender, in terms of going into the school, or if perhaps you transition while they're in a single-sex school?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question and has no really, really good answer, unfortunately. As it stands at the moment, it really depends on each individual school's policy, um, because the schools aren't, I suppose, they're not single sex because of any legislative or government reasons. They're single sex because the school chooses to be single sex. So if an individual is trans, it really depends on the school policy, and I suppose further than that, the school administration and whether or not they are happy to accept a trans person into their school. And I will say, like, there are examples across the country of trans people or trans kids in particular, um, transitioning and being part of, say, a girls' school when they were assigned male at birth. There are examples of that, but a lot of trans kids will end up going to mixed school for that reason. So it is a school by school situation, unfortunately. So there's no really good answer for that.
Anyone else have any questions? Yes.
How there's a question there about, so there was a mention there about um, with regards to my question was about how do you deal with other people if you're in company and other people are being have a discrimination towards the person. So how do you stand up? What do you recommend for standing up to
Mm,
somebody?
Did you?
I did. Oh, oh, we're frozen. Can you hear me? Uh,
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, I think we dropped off for a second, and now I'm full screen. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, perfect.
um, Yeah, to answer that question, and it's a really, really good question. And I think we've probably all, like I certainly have, but I think we've all been in situations where you hear someone talking and maybe saying things that are discriminatory or maybe just very unkind, and you're kind of thinking like, oh, sugar, how do I jump in here? And I think honestly, in a lot of ways, the best thing you can do is just kind of say that you don't agree with that. The social pressure is often enough maybe to quieten someone down because often someone will say something like that because they feel comfortable and because they think everyone agrees with them. Um, and if it becomes clear that everyone doesn't agree with them, and often it just takes one person to say, like, oh, I actually don't think that's okay to say. I don't think that that's, I actually think that might be a bit discriminatory. That can often be enough. But failing that, I also will always say, that what can be quite useful and very difficult for someone to refute is to use a very values-based kind of language. So to say something like, oh, well, I actually think that, trans people deserve respect and love in a society as much as anyone else does. And it can be, it's genuinely very difficult to argue against that um, without looking quite evil, to be quite honest, but because at that point the person has to say, I don't think they deserve respect and love, which not many people are happy to fall on that particular sword. So I would say, I suppose in terms of tips, um, yeah, standing up in the moment, even if it doesn't feel like um people like everyone's going to agree with you, often you'll find that it just takes one person to kind of to start pushing back, and you'll get a couple more supporters. And then, yeah, also using that kind of values-based language. Again, things like saying, well, I think, everyone deserves somewhere to live. It's very hard to fight against that. And the specifics, yeah, in that situation, it's just important just to push back, and you can debate the specifics one to one if that's what you want to do. But yeah, does that answer the question? Kind of.
Yeah, yeah, they said it does. I actually have one. So
Mhm.
the reason these kind of modules are being designed and added into teacher education courses is because there's a lot of fear around some of these subjects. And there can be quite a lot of fear in approaching these subjects and discussing them with students in classrooms. Would you have any suggestions on how to approach that?
How to approach speaking about this in classrooms?
How to approach maybe speaking about these kind of issues in classrooms if they come up, if you hear maybe bigoted comments, or if you're, as was just said there, if I know you've given an example of how to deal with it in maybe social situations, but how to deal with it in a classroom situation, or how to support students if they come to you, because there is that fear of saying the wrong thing. So how can
Absolutely.
you avoid that, or what can you
Yeah.
do?
Well, I suppose, yeah. again, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet for these situations, I think. But actually, my sister is a teacher, so we will often have these conversations. And in a lot of ways, I think in a lot of ways, the main things to try to do or try to remember is it's very basic, but I suppose to listen and be kind means an awful lot to a lot of LGBTQ plus individuals, and especially if they're, younger or children, teenagers, young adults. It can mean an awful lot just to listen and to be respectful and to ask questions. And I understand the fear around asking questions, but like I keep saying, I think it's most people are happy to speak about themselves and about their experience if they feel safe in that situation and safe with you as an individual. But failing that, I wouldn't hesitate to get on the phone to any of the charities that work in that particular field. Like genuinely, I know there's three charities that, for LGBTQ plus people in Dublin and kind of in Ireland, and I know for a fact that all of us are more than happy to answer any question um, or any concern or even just give some advice. Sometimes it can be useful to just chat it out with someone, and I know for a fact we're all more than happy to do that. Um, and like I said, if in talking about it in a classroom setting, like I said before, I I think it's always important to challenge it as much as possible if it comes up. I know that teachers, particularly of younger people, are experiencing quite a lot of information coming from the internet and through students towards them at times, and some very extreme opinions. And I think it's important always to challenge those in the moments and kind of make clear that that's not acceptable to talk about. And like I said, always fall back on the values-based arguments, because it's just very difficult to argue against it, um, and really makes people consider where their opinions are coming from and what impact that they're having on the people around them. Does that answer the question? Probably
Thank you
not.
very much. Sorry, one more.
Right, not to that, something that, practice like this is creating a classroom agreement at the beginning of, the semester, the term or whatever, and that way you have all of the students buy into what their agreement is and how they want to be with each other. And then if an issue arises, then maybe you can refer back to that, and then that way it's all, the specifics haven't been discussed, but say that the value of respect is being discussed. So, you have a kind of something to go back and forth.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah.
On the fact that male, there are a lot of cases actually where this trans, this man, I don't know if he was, he said he was trans, went into this email that it's also young girl,
Did that
so I'm like, wasn't trans man even,
Did you hear that, Sean?
I didn't hear that, sorry.
Um, the student was discussing a case in America where a trans male to female, I presume, went into a female bathroom and is said to have assaulted a young girl. And do you have any opinions on trans people using female bathrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I know that it's a very hot topic at the moment, but I suppose, like, broadly, trans people have used the bathrooms of the gender that they've chosen for decades and for hundreds of years, actually, at this point. and hasn't really been a massive issue. And there are of course stories that you can find, but I think you can find, like with many of these things, you can kind of find stories of anything to prove any point that you want if we go on a globalized basis. So, like in terms of the Irish context, we haven't really had much in terms of issues with that. I don't know anyone who has any issues with that, and the majority of the trans people I know, because it's such a hot topic of conversation at the moment, will simply use gender neutral bathrooms or the accessible bathroom, because it tends to be its own little thing. But yeah, I don't really have any strong opinions on it necessarily one way or the other.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sean. We will let you go. Very much appreciate your time today. And it was
Thanks for having me.
okay. Thank you. Oh, yeah, okay. Thanks.
Look,
Okay, take care. Oh God, that's me. Oh, oh no, I don't like that view of me at all.